time to do some wrestling, methinks. And what we have today is quite interesting. It's the first 3D wrestling game. It's not a WWE game, it's not a WCW game. In fact, it's a completely made up promotion with no license at all game. It's Power Move Pro Wrestling, a 1996 game made for the PS1 that is, well, very obscure indeed. It doesn't even have a frickin' entry on Wikipedia. And yet, in the history of wrestling games, it's actually, well, very important indeed. We'll go into that shortly. While Power Move Pro Wrestling is the first 3D wrestling game, it's probably one of the last to come with a wholly fictional roster. Almost everything's licensed from here on out, or at the very least the wrestlers are clearly based on real life people with slightly changed names. The game does try its best to sell a rather silly roster. We've got a monster of biblical proportions, a commandant who enjoys giving pain as much as he enjoys receiving it, a judge with some rather odd face paint, a so-called full-time dude, a lot of odd little gimmicks that wouldn't exactly have been out of place with the sort of thing you'd get in WWF's New Generation or whatever, but they could also have easily starred in the NES's almighty pro wrestling game. And the even odder thing is, well, they're all still based on real people, somewhat. You see, Power Move Pro Wrestling is an American localization of a Japanese game, Shin Nihon Pro Wrestling Toukon Retsuden from 1995, and that is a licensed game for New Japan Pro Wrestling. The game features all the NJPW stars of the day, Masa Chono, Keiji Muto, Shinya Hashimoto, Jushin Thunder Liger et al. The game was made by Yuke's and it was the first in a series of a couple. And when the WWF handed the license to make their games over to THQ, it was Toukon Retsuden that inspired them to pick Yuke's to create the SmackDown series of games. Well, that and they already had Aki working on the Nintendo 64 games. The SmackDown games were, at first, partially based on the Toukon Retsuden games. God, I've said that about 3 times differently now. Hell, considering how slow the evolution of these games can be at points, one wonders if there's still the odd ancient animation from the Toukon days still kicking about in 2K's WWE games today. And so, the long and short of it is that this very obscure game with the made up wrestlers is the only game from this generation where you can trace a clear line from this to the WWE games of today that are basically the only game in town when it comes to wrestling. Funny that, isn't it? With all that interest in history though, is Power Move Pro Wrestling a good game? Actually, for me it kind of is. It's very old for sure, but I do still get a good kick out of it. It wasn't reviewed well at all from what I remember, and it's not as good as any of Aki's N64 games or its closest contemporary, WCW vs. the World, but I certainly prefer it in retrospect to, say, any of Acclaim's more famous efforts like WWF Warzone and what have you. The grappling system is quite fast, the good sort where you tap buttons for quick moves and hold them for strong ones. It should be immediately familiar to anyone who's played an Aki game. Still, the cool thing is that being a Japanese game, you do get a lot of Japanese-style wrestling moves. Considering what you got in the past, it was pretty cool to suddenly see folks dropping each other with nicely animated tiger suplexes, inverted pile drivers, and fisherman busters. You can also do suicide dives and the like, which had hardly been seen in games up to this point, let alone moves from off the turnbuckle. The presentation is quite fun too. Power Move Pro Wrestling comes with its own announcer, the oddly named Gorgon, who does his level best to sell all of these made-up fighters. The graphics might not have aged well, but hey, it's always nice to see animated wrestling moves, and while these ones aren't as powerful as some of the stuff that Aki used to come up with, they're still good enough. The best thing about this game though is the matches themselves. I can always come back to this game and have a good, lengthy back and forth match where I might win or lose. I don't have to work it in any way, and it feels like a wrestling match with everything that I would expect. Sometimes they might end on a silly submission move, but hey ho, that sort of thing can happen in any wrestling game. That's the key to a wrestling game, for a fan. Dueler matches actually feel like wrestling matches. That can be so hard to emulate, and the current WWE games have a hell of a time trying to do it, even after so many iterations. And yet this first effort from Yuke's, over 20 years old by this point, does a better job of it than most of the efforts that they produce today. Power Move Pro Wrestling is, like I said, a very obscure game. Not because it's rare, just because it barely got any reviews at all, let alone good ones. I'm sure that you'd have no trouble finding a copy of it, and you probably wouldn't pay much at all. And I would highly recommend it. The only thing that might stop you is the silly made-up wrestlers, but for me that's another level of amusement all on its own. And hell, if you want real wrestlers, you can always try to find a copy of the original Toukon Retsuden. There's not all that many options to boot, just single and tag matches, along with title bouts and the option to do a tournament or league, much like New Japan's G1 Climax. Still, it does what it's got very well. No, it's not as good as the likes of WCW NWO Revenge and what have you, but I didn't have an N64 back then, I had a PS1. And this odd little game was, for a long time, one of the best that we could get. And it actually was really quite good. It's absolutely worth having a look at. Trust me. Trust me. See you tomorrow.